when we're cooped up in a building, it's like being in a cave, and it will throw us back to that idea of being in a cave. The outside environment is a place where there are threats but also opportunities. So we'll be feeling the threat now as imposed upon us by the government, and also in the form of these COVID marshals that are being proposed.
Unbelievable.
And we will react to them instinctively as if they were predators.
Yes.
Yeah, so obviously where we are in sort of the Mersey region of the UK, Boris Johnson came out and he said, you're going to go into tier 3 lockdown.
Yes.
This basically means something like pubs are going to be closing at like 6 p.m, gyms can't open at all. Basically, you're going to live in your house and you're going to be pleased about it. Of course, we did a video back in March, I think, when the lockdown first hit, and I think it was you, Steve, was it? It might have been Pauline. Predicted riots, essentially, back in that video. That what happens as a social experiment if you lock people up inside? So, well, the instincts are going to start kicking back. Yeah. So, well, obviously, since the lockdowns happened, is basically when I've started my work as a therapist over Zoom and online. I think we said in the previous video we've recorded today that complexes and the anima and the animus are the things we mostly work through. And if we reframe the anima and the animus as what it truly is, which is the relating function, then you can see exactly what happens in an individuation neurosis. And I think the lockdown situation sort of frames that problem quite nicely. It's like, what would make one fall off a timeline? What would make someone feel not particularly brilliant in themselves but not have a major psychiatric condition? That's sort of like a colloquial way of phrasing perhaps an individuation neurosis. And the big one, the huge one which comes up time and time again is no friends. Yeah, I can't go out and see people. Because an example I bring up with guys who come speak to me, because obviously they're normally younger and they've been to university and other stuff like that. Stuff like drinking, it's like you go out, you have a great time, and there's no problems when you're out hanging about in the pub or at a nightclub or whatever else. But you wake up the next morning by yourself and you feel terrible in your own head. And the anxiety comes in, the biting voices come in, things like that. Yeah. But then a friend calls you, or you go downstairs, or there's other people down there, and it goes away. So it's like the state-dependent nature of lots of these unpleasant things that occur in your own psychology are removed within social contact. So I was wondering what you guys thought about what a further lockdown could do, and this is right up to like Christmas now, potentially.
It will go beyond that.
What this could do to people's mental functioning, because we don't exist in just by ourselves, individuating on our own. We need other people around us, and perhaps videos like this could help fill some of that void in some capacity. I was wondering what you guys thought about how severe that really could be for people.
Well, I think for me, and I have a cousin actually, so it's close to home really at the moment, who lives alone and is facing a lot of these anxieties alone. And the thing that she's flagged up, and was in my mind as well, to be honest, before she actually mentioned it, was the seasonal difference for a start, as we move into autumn and winter, and the nights are moving in, it's becoming darker earlier, and that alone is obviously going to impact on people's well-being, because at least during the spring and summer months people were able to go out, they could go for walks, they could, if they even if they were living alone, the chances are that they would maybe meet somebody out socially on a walk, even if it's a stranger, somebody they didn't know, because the situation was such that people, even strangers during that time, were acknowledging one another and going out of their way to be friendly. So at least that sociability then could extend out into the environment, whereas now we're looking at I think a very different set of circumstances, as we're already in the autumn, but as we move into the winter months, and then of course things like Christmas will be pending, that's only around the corner. So all of these I think mark a very different set of circumstances to the ones that we had back in March, and I think therefore it's going to affect more people negatively than maybe it did back then. So it is a very concerning time. Yeah, very concerning really. I mean, we're already starting to see an increase in the number of suicides, obviously, amongst young people, or people coming to us, clinically for help. So we expect that to continue and probably increase as well.
Yeah, my own view, because of probably my personality type, I tend to scan out using extroverted intuition and try and look for patterns that are working themselves through. And when that happened last time, The immediacy for me was the regressive trend towards a Paleolithic level of response, an old Stone Age level of response. When we're cooped up in a building, it's like being in a cave, and it will throw us back to that idea of being in a cave. The outside environment is a place where there are threats but also opportunities. So we'll be feeling the threat now as imposed upon us by the government, and also in the form of these COVID marshals that are being proposed.
Unbelievable.
And we will react to them instinctively as if they were
Yes.
predators
Yes.
or competitors,
Yeah.
which will mean there's going to be a reaction against them at an instinctive level. Now, whether that's acted out or not depends upon a lot of things. But last time I predicted that the police would be looked upon as being predators, and that did seem to happen, particularly in London.
Yes.
In the UK. It's also happening in the US, and there'll be a reaction. But that was mitigated because lockdown was lifted, and people began to reorientate themselves in a more or less normal way. But to have it reimposed is a huge mistake.
Yes.
At one level, there'll be an unconscious awareness of herd immunity.
Yes.
This will be instinctive because our ancestors have been through and experienced and passed through and survived, most of them. In fact, all of our ancestors have survived every kind of pandemic we've had, or else we wouldn't be here.
Yeah.
And they will have an awareness of herd immunity at an instinctive level. And that will mean people will want to go out and expose themselves to this virus and get through it in a selective sense, because the genome will be pushing us to do it. You then add that to this Paleolithic mentality. We're going to see people going out foraging for food in the way they did last time, so the shops are going to get stripped of essentials. People will be superficially nice but suspicious of one another, particularly now that the government is asking people to inform upon each other over whether they're breaking these rules.
Yes.
This is going to create the potential for a lot of problems, and already we're seeing resistance coming through from local political leaders who are saying pretty much that they're not going to follow the government's guidelines because they know they can't keep the lid on the instincts that are going to power their way through. So I think there'll be a push, a natural level push towards herd immunity. That will of course mean a lot of people are going to get sick. But because it's instinctive, it will have an irrational element to it. And when you try and override that politically with rationality, you will get the instinctive pressure to push back against that. It's a recipe for disaster. It's not been handled properly. One reason why is that the government in the UK have progressively eroded national identity. That makes it harder for people to bond together. It means they're going to fracture into smaller local groups based on the family. This is very, very ancient, very old. This is deeply Paleolithic. If you want to move people away from Paleolithic, you have to give them a higher level of collective representation and reference. In other words, the nation state. But patriotism has become unpopular, so therefore people are going to become tribal and then down to the family level of protection. That will mean we will see predators and competitors everywhere, and if it goes on, there will be trouble. An alternative, as I say, is people will just ignore it, and they'll be pushed by the genome to face the virus and gain herd immunity despite the losses that might follow from that. Because we know instinctively that our ancestors have dealt with bubonic plague several times, all sorts of infections in the past, and we are descended from the people who survived that. So the genome collectively will push us towards doing it. It will feel compulsive, it will feel irrational but nevertheless persuasive, and we can bet that kind of thing will start to emerge, but there'll be a lot of conflict with the police, and there'll be lots of conflict with these so-called COVID marshals who will appear to be jumped up local upstarts who are trying to maximise in a parasitical way their own resources, feeding off this current crisis. So I can see the potential for it going seriously wrong.
I reckon if you're going to have like predictions on that, I reckon if they come out and say there's going to be a mandatory vaccine, I think that's when things are going to fall. There's also, by the way, the theory behind vaccines. What you're taught, one of the first things in biology class that you're taught about is that vaccines, you give people an attenuated version of a pathogen, and then you give it to enough people over time, and you get herd immunity.
Yeah.
Basically, that most people are immune, therefore there's no means for this to spread. It's just destroyed as soon as it enters somebody's body. It's like, okay, that doesn't square well with what you've just said. No. If there comes with a mandatory thing, I don't. You see this stuff like the March for Freedom and stuff down in London. They're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Yeah. You're seeing more clashes between the public and the police. It's only going to keep growing.
Yeah, it is. I mean, women understand this kind of thing because women with young children tend to expose their own children to other people's children.
Yeah.
With that herd immunity, with chickenpox, not so much measles, but certainly chickenpox because it's a much milder illness. But they will deliberately they call them chickenpox parties, and it's a deliberate, attempt to expose children to the virus and to literally get it over with, and to move things on, and so at that again very. Instinctive level, women know that it's probably a good thing to do, and they do it, and it's a natural way of doing it. And of course, to some extent, doctors, GPs acquire herd immunity because of all the people, otherwise they'd get every illness that walked into the surgery. So we know instinctively that these things work and can work, but it's as if we've missed the opportunity to do it because in battening down the hatches and having the lockdown when we did back in the spring and the summer, when it would have the virus would have been weaker, and it would have been a good time for people to be therefore to be exposed to it and get a weaker version of it. We're now doing it as it's actually grown in strength, and there are obviously experts who talk about these things, and they have suggested that say December would have been a better time, for example, if we were going to do something like this and protect the vulnerable categories of people that are often described, then that would have been the time to go for a complete lockdown and not now. But like you say, Steve, it's been handled very badly, really. Yes.
The government will become the enemy, not the virus.
They will.
That's the mistake that they've made because they haven't bonded the country together because the country doesn't exist. England is no longer a country, it's a soccer team.
It is,
or some other sport. It's an abstraction, it's not an identity anymore. It's been eroded. That forces people into localised groupings and identities which will then eventually conflict with one another. It's obvious that it will go that way under sufficient pressure, and this is one of those potentially sufficient pressures that could break the whole social cohesion. Hope it doesn't go that far. I hope that's not a prediction, but always think, what will instincts do? How will they handle a situation? That will give you your best indicator, because it's happened before, and we're programmed genetically to respond to large-scale threats in the same way, unconsciously, and it will emerge. It will appear first as frustration. We're at that level now. Frustration is kicked in. Then there'll have to be a solution to that frustration in one form or another.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things, again, that my cousin has flagged up, Steve, is the very point that you make about these sort of self-imposed marshals, that she's already experiencing people snitching on one another, even when, they don't know the full circumstances for someone. Nonetheless, they're choosing to, invest their energy in that particular way. And like you say, that will... it will break down communities rather than be a cohesive thing, and I hate to think that where this is going to go, to be honest with you.
Well, this is also like fresh off the back of Brexit as well. It was only a few short years, one election cycle ago, basically, and that caused such divisions in the country. So this is built
families
up on it.
Too.
Yes, it's like Jane. I was thinking about there's someone on YouTube who we follow. There's like a girl and a husband, and she was pregnant. They make vlogs and stuff like that. And in one of the videos, she's moved house somewhere, but obviously she shows in the video, it's just like at the beginning of the original lockdown, that she's not wearing a mask and her family are around, and her fans, the comment section rips into her. People unsubscribing, dislike, I hate you, how dare you. It's like, but this is meant to be like a happy place where you watch people talk about happy, lovely things. What the hell is happening? It's not going to go well.
It's a very, very divisive thing, isn't it? And I think a lot of it too is Are people's suspicion that they're not being given the right kind of information, or that the figures are being manipulated in some way? And so, you know, you start from a position, certainly with respect to the government, of not really trusting where they're coming from. So everything else that they have to say thereafter, you know, you tend to be suspicious of. And again, it doesn't instill confidence. And people it will become tribal. You're right, Steve. I think that's probably the best way of looking
because
at
that's
it.
that and the family are the fundamental levels.
Yes.
The family in their own cave, their own house. That's so Paleolithic. That's beyond Neanderthal. That's way back.
It is. Yes.
And then the competition for resources. So this so-called snitching and that will increase because neighbours become competitors for resources.
They do.
Then, but instead of having a small group of ancient humans living in a cave in one part of a specific ecological territory and in another, we're on top of one another basically, but we're compressed, so the stresses are increased massively. So the potential for serious violence and social decohesion is huge.
It is, and it's being I think it's being amplified by the response of the police. I mean, they've become so involved in social media and social issues these days, and they'll be turning up at people's doors. I mean, they have done already. And I mean, just thinking about what you said, Steve, about the idea of your home being, well, it's like your castle as well as your cave, isn't it?
Yeah.
And people instinctively will respond very badly to that kind of intrusion into their homes, where they feel that is literally the last what's the expression?
It's last defence, isn't it?
Yes, it's the last place of defence, isn't it? And if you have that kind of an intrusion into there, then again people are going to react very badly to that.
Yeah.
And understandably so.
Yeah, to some extent the government deserve it, and I'm not suggesting that there should therefore be any kind of issue that follows on from it, but they've mishandled it. And the problem with power is it will never let go. The only way to change power is through an agreed process. That's either through the ballot box or it's through an alternative. And if you force people onto their instincts, various alternatives will surface to the ballot box. It just makes sense, unfortunately. Yeah.
And they're trying to manipulate people on their fear. And fear, of course, is an instinct.
Yes.
So you know, you can't help that from welling up in you.
No.
And it's as if so little of what we hear is reassuring and common sense anymore. It's off the scale to frighten people and to literally come down with an iron glove and you know, it's you resist at your peril, basically.
Yeah.
And that's how they want you to feel. That's where they want you to be.
Yeah, I think they've made a mistake there. They've misjudged what's left of this country's freedoms as they exist in the minds of ordinary people. They've probably misjudged that. They can buy them off of alcohol and pubs being open 24/7, which was Tony Blair's way of breaking this country's soul. But there's enough of it still left. We haven't migrated sufficiently into totalitarianism yet for them to get away with it scot-free.